I will tell you something most people are never taught clearly enough to use. Debt is not automatically the enemy. Ignorant debt is the enemy. That difference is the whole subject. Most people spend their lives reacting to money rather than structuring it. They work for income, use income to pay bills, use leftover income to finance symbols, and then wonder why their life feels busy but never really expands. They think the bank is a predator standing outside the game. In truth, the bank is simply a machine. It lends, it prices risk, it rewards structure, it punishes confusion. The same institution that quietly eats one man's future can become the fuel source behind another man's freedom. The difference is not income alone. The difference is leverage, structure, spread, discipline, and time. When I was young in Omaha, I learned very early that money behaves differently depending on whether it is controlled emotionally or rationally. In the grocery business, I watched men buy what they could not truly afford because they wanted relief, image, momentum, or the simple pleasure of not saying no to themselves. Later, I watched businessmen use borrowed money to control productive assets and expand their reach. The first kind of borrowing made men smaller. The second kind made them larger. Once you see that distinction clearly, the whole conversation about debt changes. The public has been taught a childish moral story. Debt bad, cash good. Borrowing weak, paying cash strong. That story is simple enough for a slogan and sloppy enough to keep millions financially average. The truth is more demanding. A man who borrows to consume makes tomorrow work harder, so today can feel softer. A man who borrows to acquire makes borrowed capital go to work, so his own future does not remain trapped inside wages alone. That is the line. And because the line is so rarely explained, well, most people step over it without noticing. They finance cars that begin depreciating the minute the tires leave the lot. They finance vacations whose only remaining value after 30 days is photographs and a payment obligation. They finance furniture, clothing, upgrades, and every other visible sign of progress that does nothing to improve their cash position. Then they say debt is dangerous. Of course it is dangerous when it is strapped to vanity. A match is dangerous too if you hand it to a child in a dry forest. The problem is not the fire. The problem is the operator. I have never admired debt for its own sake. I admire what disciplined people can do with cheap, fixed, intelligently structured capital when it is attached to productive assets. That is an entirely different thing from borrowing to impersonate success. The first principle is brutally simple. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. Acquisition means control of something that produces, something that throws off cash, something that appreciates while also serving a durable economic function, a rental property with real spread, a business with actual revenue, equipment that expands output, an operating asset whose earnings support the debt that acquired it. Those things may still contain risk. Of course they do. But they at least enter the room with a rational case for why borrowed money is present. Ego debt enters the room with a different case. Look at me. I deserve this. I can manage the payment. Everybody else is upgrading. I work hard. I should live a little. Those sentences have emptied more pockets than recessions. A consumer asks, can I handle the monthly payment? An investor asks, what does this asset return annually after all the friction has been stripped out? That single change in language is one of the biggest upgrades a person can make. When I hear someone describe a purchase in monthly terms, I immediately want to know what has been excluded. Maintenance, taxes, insurance, opportunity cost, depreciation, the cost of tying up future cash flow, the cost of lost flexibility. These things disappear when a person is under the spell of consumption. They reappear later as pressure. When I hear a rational allocator describe a purchase, the first question is yield. What comes back? What survives stress? Who pays the debt if the owner has a bad quarter? Does the asset feed itself? Can it raise prices? Does it sit inside a stable demand structure? Does it improve my financial position, even if I never get the emotional pleasure of being seen with it? That is a very different conversation. Suppose one man borrows $50,000 for a luxury sport utility vehicle. The bank is happy, the dealer is happy, The man's neighbors may even be impressed for a little while, but the cash flow runs in one direction. Out, the vehicle asks for insurance, maintenance, fuel, repairs, and then politely loses value. The debt did not expand his economic territory, it narrowed it. Suppose another man uses the same $50,000 as a down payment on a small cash-flowing property or a practical operating business. Now the cash flow can run both ways into the asset and back out of it. The debt is still real. The obligation is still real. But the structure has a chance to make the owner larger instead of smaller. This is what the wealthy understand that the middle class is rarely taught clearly. Debt is not slavery by default. Irresponsible debt is slavery. Strategic debt is leverage. And leverage used correctly is control without full upfront ownership. That is very powerful. Without leverage, wealth grows linearly for most ordinary people. Save, wait, save, wait, save, wait over long enough stretches that can still work, and I will never mock the power of consistent saving. But leverage compresses time when the spread is favorable. It allows $100,000 to control $500,000 of productive value. It lets a person act with more economic reach than his current cash pile would otherwise permit. That is why the wealthy do not ask only what something costs. They ask what they control by paying that cost and what that controlled asset may produce over time. But here is the warning that has to be said just as plainly. Leverage does not fix stupidity. It magnifies discipline, and it magnifies recklessness. If you are careless, leverage gets you to the ditch faster. If you are controlled, patient, and well-structured, leverage can accelerate freedom. That is why the second principle matters so much. Leverage is power. Over-leverage is collapse. I have seen many people who thought they understood leverage because they understood the upside. That is not understanding. That is infatuation. They saw appreciation. They saw growing rent rolls. They saw equity growth on paper. They saw the possibility of owning 3 things instead of 1. What they did not see clearly enough was what happens when one tenant stops paying, one refinancing window closes, one rate resets higher, one repair shows up at the wrong moment, one key customer walks away, or one market softens, while their obligations remain inflexible. That is where the line between strength and fragility becomes visible. A person is over-leveraged whenever a modest disruption becomes a crisis. That is the right definition, not a ratio quoted at dinner. A structural reality. If one vacancy, one delay, one temporary shock can shove the whole machine into panic, you were never strong. You were only extended. Margin is what separates the two. Margin is breathing room. Margin is the gap between what your obligations require and what your life can tolerate. Margin is the reserve that lets a bad month remain a bad month instead of becoming an emergency. I love margin. I distrust structures that do not have it. The bank will often lend you more than is wise for your personal peace. Do not confuse approval with wisdom. The bank's models protect the bank. Your job is to protect your life. If a lender says you qualify for $500,000, you must still ask whether $350,000 keeps your structure safer. If a lender says you can take on 5 properties, you must still ask whether 3 well-spaced, well-capitalized properties produce a calmer and more durable result. Overexpansion is usually fueled by ego disguised as ambition. Controlled expansion is patience disguised as modesty. I prefer the second. A leveraged asset should not merely look promising in ideal conditions. It should survive irritation. It should survive inconvenience. It should survive a little humiliation from the market. That means reserves. It means 6 months of debt service at a minimum. In many cases, preferably more if the asset class is volatile or the income stream is thin. It means not borrowing to the edge of your own emotional stability. It means understanding whether the debt is fixed or variable. Fixed debt is a known river. Variable debt is a river whose depth can change while you are still standing in it. Sometimes variable debt can be managed well. Often it is just another source of uncertainty layered onto a structure that already has enough moving parts. A serious person respects fixed-rate debt during inflationary periods because inflation changes the real burden of nominally fixed repayment. This is one of the least emotional and most powerful truths in finance. Inflation punishes savers holding idle cash. It punishes people whose incomes cannot keep up and whose liabilities are rising. But inflation can reward owners of scarce productive assets financed with long-term fixed debt. Why? Because the payment remains nominally fixed while rents, replacement costs, business revenue, and asset values often move upward over time. You are repaying yesterday's debt with tomorrow's weaker dollars. That is not cheating. That is simply understanding the monetary environment better than the average person. If I take a fixed payment and place it against an asset whose cash flows rise with inflation, then the real weight of the debt declines over time while the productive value of the asset expands. That is why good debt can create peace in inflationary periods, while people who hold only cash and wages feel increasingly squeezed. The crowd thinks debt is the pressure. Often the real pressure is being unpositioned for inflation while pretending that debt avoidance is the same thing as strength. But again, structure decides everything. Inflation is only an ally if the debt is fixed, the asset can reprice or appreciate, the cash flow remains positive, and the spread survives stress. Inflation is not a parachute for stupidity. It is a tailwind for sound structures. This leads us to the mathematics of spread, which is where wealth stops being mystical and starts becoming engineered. Spread is simply the difference between what borrowed money costs you and what the asset purchased with that money returns to you. Asset yield minus cost of capital equals spread. That is not poetry. It is the essential arithmetic of leverage. If you borrow at 6% and your asset reliably produces 12%, you have a positive spread. If you borrow at 7% and the asset throws off nothing or something too weak and uncertain to survive friction, you are financing decline. That is why I say the wealthy fall in love with numbers, not properties, not stories, not identities. A beautiful property with a bad spread is not attractive to me. An ordinary-looking asset with reliable positive spread and strong downside durability is gross numbers are for salespeople. Net numbers are for owners. A rational borrower subtracts operating expenses, maintenance, taxes, insurance, vacancy assumptions, management costs, and likely friction before announcing what the asset yields. Amateurs assume perfection. Professionals assume friction. Friction is reality. There is another subtlety here that many people miss. Not all positive spreads deserve the same respect. A stable 2% spread in a deeply durable asset with strong tenants, resilient demand, and conservative leverage may be better than a projected 15% spread resting on optimistic assumptions and fragile behavior. Consistency builds wealth. Spikes build stories. I have seen many fortunes damaged by people chasing the largest projected spread while ignoring survivability. The whole purpose of leverage is not to look daring. It is to create controlled asymmetry. Limited downside because the structure is sensible. Meaningful upside because time and reinvestment magnify the positive spread. And when that spread is harvested and reinvested, something beautiful begins happening. Leverage stops being a one-time act and becomes a compounding system. One asset creates positive cash flow. That cash flow creates seed capital. Seed capital funds another acquisition or strengthens reserves until the next expansion is rational. The new asset adds more spread. More spread creates more options. That is how the wealthy make the bank finance their expansion instead of financing their consumption. Notice the key difference. Amateurs consume profits. Professionals reinvest profits. If an asset throws off an extra $1,000 a month, and that money immediately becomes restaurant spending, status spending, lifestyle upgrades, or symbols, the leverage has been neutralized. If that $1,000 is systematically redirected into reserves, debt optimization, or the next compounding engine, then leverage begins doing its real job. This is why I say debt plus compounding plus time creates asymmetry. The spark is leverage, the engine is compounding, the fuel is time, The driver is discipline. Emotion is the enemy. Now, because human beings are not spreadsheets, we have to address the psychological war of debt. Numbers alone do not determine the outcome. The same debt that enriches one person destroys another, because the operator changes the result. Debt amplifies who you already are. If you are calm, it gives calm more scale. If you are impulsive, it gives impulsiveness more consequences. If you are fearful, it multiplies fear. If you are greedy, it accelerates greed. That is why emotional neutrality matters so much. Some people are too frightened to borrow at all. They cling to safety, but it is a safety that often hides stagnation. They avoid leverage entirely, hold excessive cash, and slowly watch inflation outrun them. Their fear protects them from embarrassment and robs them of expansion. Others go the other way. They taste one early success and immediately become arrogant. One property works, one business expands, one refinancing goes well. They begin mistaking a favorable environment for personal invincibility. Then they stack debt too quickly. Shrink reserves, ignore concentration, and allow confidence to become fragility wearing expensive shoes. Both extremes fail. The goal is not fearlessness. It is emotional neutrality supported by structural strength. A person who knows he has reserves behaves differently from one who does not. A person who has positive cash flow and fixed terms thinks differently from one who relies on hope and rising prices. A person whose debt is attached to productive, durable assets feels differently from one whose debt is attached to ego consumption. Psychological strength does not float freely above the balance sheet. It is often created by the balance sheet. Strong structure creates calm, weak structure creates drama, and drama is where wealth leaks out. There is also a social challenge here. Once you begin using debt intelligently, many people around you will not understand what you are doing. They have been trained to think only in moral categories: debt bad, paying cash good, financial simplicity pure, borrowing suspicious. They will project their fear onto your structure. Fine. Take advice from people who understand risk, spread, and cash flow. Be polite with everyone else. The world also trains people to confuse early profit with permanent wealth. That is deadly. As soon as leverage assets begin throwing off meaningful cash flow, ego reappears in a new costume. Now you deserve more. Now you can upgrade. Now you can live bigger. If you listen too early, you kill the compounding engine at exactly the stage where it was beginning to become powerful. Lifestyle creep is one of the most effective assassins of good leverage. That is why your relationship with debt must become neutral, not proud, not ashamed, not theatrical. Debt is arithmetic, not identity. Then comes a deeper layer of mastery, knowing when to hold debt and when to kill it. This is where adults separate from zealots. Leverage is a phase, not a religion. A person who fears all debt is missing the point. A person who clings to all debt forever out of pride is also missing the point. There are stages to this. In the early stage, debt is acquisition fuel. You use it to enter markets, control assets, and compress time. In the middle stage, debt is optimized. Rates can be refinanced, terms extended, structures improved, cash flow strengthened. In the later stage, debt becomes optional. That is one of the most beautiful words in finance. Optional debt is very different, psychologically, from necessary debt. Necessary debt feels heavy. Optional debt feels strategic. Once assets are producing strong cash flow, reserves are healthy, and equity is substantial, the question changes: does this debt still improve my structure? Does it still serve my spread? Does it still enhance optionality, or has the marginal benefit of leverage fallen below the value of simplicity and peace? This is not a universal answer. It depends on rates, taxes, opportunities, temperament, and timing. If I hold fixed debt at 3% on an asset throwing off good cash flow in an inflationary world, why should I race to eliminate it if the capital used for prepayment could earn much more elsewhere with acceptable risk? Cheap debt can be extremely valuable. The wealthy often refinance rather than repay for exactly that reason. They reposition debt. They do not blindly destroy it. On the other hand, if the spread disappears, if the interest rate outruns asset return, if stability becomes more important than growth, or if retirement is approaching and the emotional value of lower leverage becomes meaningful, then reducing debt can be wise. What I refuse is absolutism. The crowd wants simple commandments. Good thinking usually produces conditional answers. There is one place, however, where I do become almost absolute: high-interest consumer debt. Credit cards at 18%, personal loans at 12 or more. Revolving debt used to sustain lifestyle. There is no elegance there. That is not leverage. That is leakage. Kill it. Immediately, ruthlessly. Every extra dollar sent toward that kind of debt is buying a remarkable guaranteed return in the form of avoided financial damage. Now, once your first compounding engine works, another danger appears: concentration. Leverage builds empires. Concentration can collapse them. If all your debt, all your assets, all your confidence, and all your identity are tied to one city, one market, one type of tenant, one business model, or one revenue stream, then success itself becomes dangerous. Because leverage magnifies concentration, strategic diversification is not the same thing as random accumulation. I do not want people collecting shiny objects and calling it risk management. I want diversification from strength, not from confusion. That means mastering one system first, one asset class, one operating structure. Only when it is stable, expanding into adjacent opportunities that reduce correlated risk. Residential real estate may be paired later with small commercial exposure. A service business may add a digital product. A portfolio of cash-flowing assets may include dividend, paying equities or other resilient income streams. The goal is not to own everything. The goal is to avoid having your whole life shaken by one type of bad weather. This applies to debt too. Stagger maturities when possible. Do not let everything come due in the same year. Do not depend on one lender if alternatives can be cultivated. Optionality is power. Banks should become fuel sources, not single-point gatekeepers, and that leads naturally to credit positioning. Most people walk into a bank hoping to be approved. The wealthy aim to become the kind of borrower banks compete to finance. That difference changes everything. A strong credit profile lowers the cost of capital. Lower cost of capital improves spread. Improved spread accelerates growth. Everything loops back to arithmetic. So treat your credit like a financial reputation, because that is what it is. Pay on time, always. Keep utilization controlled. Maintain reserves, present income intelligently. Understand how lenders evaluate self-employed borrowers. Use relationships professionally. If a better structure exists elsewhere, move. Loyalty in finance should serve the structure, not the ego. When banks want you, you choose terms, you negotiate, you protect margin. That is power. But access to capital means nothing if you do not know how to deploy it into compounding machines. This is where most people still think too small. Buying one asset is not the end game. Building systems is something that produces with limited direct dependence on your daily physical presence. Rental properties with management structure, businesses with operating teams, scalable digital products, dividend streams on autopilot, reinvestment plans that move cash into productive uses without demanding drama every week. Stage 1 is labor income. Stage 2 is asset income. Stage 3 is system income. That is the real progression. A great many people use leverage to buy one or two assets and then stop at the level of improved income. Better than wages alone. Yes, not yet financial sovereignty. Sovereignty is when your life no longer depends on permission. Not permission from an employer, not permission from a bank, not permission from the mood of the market. It is when your structure protects your freedom across conditions. That requires diversified income streams, strong reserves, conservative leverage, relative to equity, controlled expenses, and enough calm that opportunities are selected rather than chased. At that stage, debt is no longer necessary in the emotional sense. It becomes optional, selectively useful, sometimes attractive, sometimes unnecessary. That is the highest stage, not debt, free purity, sovereign optionality. And underneath all of this lies the deepest layer of the whole subject, identity. If you still think like a consumer, no amount of technical knowledge about leverage will save you. If your identity seeks status, leverage will become a costume. If your identity seeks freedom, leverage can become architecture. This is the part almost nobody wants to hear because it sounds soft, and yet it is harder than any spreadsheet. The broke identity asks, how do I pay this bill? The wealth identity asks, how do I allocate this capital? The broke identity reacts. The wealth identity positions. The broke identity seeks relief. The wealth identity seeks structure. This does not mean pretending to be rich. I dislike theatrical self-help almost as much as I dislike bad debt. It means learning to think in terms of opportunity cost, spread, durability, reserves, and future control even before your balance sheet is large. A person who gets a raise and instantly upgrades lifestyle is still operating from the old identity. A person who gets a raise and first strengthens reserves, investments, and productive assets is already thinking like an allocator. That is the transition that matters. Consumption psychology is where many promising people fail. The first taste of financial improvement creates temptation. More comfort, more image, more proof. But if every increase in income is immediately converted into visible lifestyle, compounding dies young. Wealth becomes a performance instead of a system. You must decide whether you want status or freedom. The two often conflict in the middle years. Freedom. Focused people look modest longer. Status. Focused people often look successful earlier. Time exposes the difference. There is also guilt to overcome. Some people sabotage wealth because they feel uneasy about wanting more. That is sentimental nonsense. Ethical wealth built through value creation, sound structure, and productive assets is not theft. It is contribution. It creates housing, jobs, services, output, and optionality. Do not apologize for building strength responsibly. The final principle is integration. Leverage without identity is dangerous. Identity without structure is fantasy. Structure without durability is fragile. Durability without philosophy is hollow. Philosophy without execution is useless. You must weave them together. Audit your life honestly. Eliminate destructive debt, build reserves, borrow only for acquisition, calculate spread soberly, structure fixed debt intelligently when conditions justify it. Use inflation as an ally where possible. Strengthen your credit and your lender relationships without becoming dependent on either. Deploy borrowed money only into compounding machines. Reinvest before upgrading. Diversify from strength. Time your structure, not the headlines. Build systems beyond labor. Then grow toward optionality and finally. This is how you make the bank work for you, not by cheating, not by pretending you discovered a secret chamber under the economy. By understanding the public rules better than the average player and refusing to use debt in the childish ways the system profits from most. The bank does not care whether your loan bought a jet ski or a duplex. It gets paid either way. Your job is to care. Your job is to know whether the loan expands your control over productive reality or simply finances your urge to feel larger than you are. That is the dividing line. The first group uses credit because it lacks money and wants relief. The second group avoids all debt because it fears paying the bank. The third group learns to make the bank finance productive expansion while it captures the spread, the appreciation, the inflation advantage, and the compounding. I know which group builds real wealth. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Debt is neutral. Your intention gives it direction. Spread tells the truth. Margin keeps you alive. Compounding rewards patience. Inflation can become your ally if structure is sound. Cheap fixed debt can be powerful. Expensive consumer debt is poison. Reputation lowers your cost of capital. Systems matter more than single deals. And the final goal is not simply to get rich. The final goal is to become structurally unbreakable. That is the only kind of wealth that truly interests me.